All right. Well, before we get started, I wanted to take a moment and acknowledge that we are talking again about the social injustice and exclusion experienced by trans folks. If you're watching this and you are trans, I want you to know we love you. We're glad you're here, but also you're free to go. You have done your homework. If you don't have the spoons tonight, feel free to take a lap. We'll see you next week. For the rest of us, buckle up, because I think Cindy has something for us. And we're going to cover a wide range of national issues from a critical thinking approach. And I'm just excited to dive in. How are y'all doing tonight? You ready to get into it?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Sure.
All right. Well, Cindy, last week, President Biden... I don't think I'd really said those words together on air. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Well, I'm sorry.
Moment.
Just had a quick moment.
There, yeah.
All right. Last week, President Biden repealed the ban on transgender service members. So let's start there. It seems like the two main arguments for barring trans folks from military service are around transphobia preventing unit cohesion, I guess. You know, this idea that having trans folks inside of a unit will cause a lot of disruptions. Basically, that transphobia will cause transphobia. And then the other argument seems to be around the medical expenses that trans folks experience and the drain that will cause on the economics of war, I guess. When we apply a critical thinking lens, how do we break down these ideas and get under these arguments to see, how they hold up?
So first of all, before answering addressing those two arguments, I would like to say that I was in the French army for and there was no issue during the transition there. I know a few cases of people who did it, and there is no ban, there is no rule preventing it. It's just complicated because of some people's mentality, but it's not forbidden like it was in the US. So regarding this argument that people are homophobic, therefore we shouldn't allow trans people, I think if we apply this argument to all situations, like there are racist people in the army, so why shouldn't we ban Black people for enlisting? There is homophobia, so why shouldn't we ban homosexual people from serving too? I think that's a real stupid argument. Instead of solving the issue, we just try to avoid it and avoid creating problems. I think that's a real bad approach to this issue.
It reminds me of the scene in West Wing where they're talking about the don't ask, don't tell policy. And I believe Admiral Fitzwallace, one of the characters, said, of course, having gays in the military would disrupt the unit, right? And everyone's like, yes, sir. He's like, that's what they said about Black people. And it did disrupt the unit, and the unit got over it. So, yeah, I think that, catering to the lowest common denominator here is not an approach to take that stands up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and regarding this budget thing, I think that's one of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard, because the US has a military budget that's equivalent to the next, I think it's 6 countries in the world. So if you add Russia, China, England, France, and I don't remember which are the other 2 countries, then you get to the budget of the US. So
you're goddamn right you do.
I really don't think that's a valid argument. I don't even, well, yeah, we've heard a lot of crazy things in the US in the last 4 years, and maybe more in the last 10 years. But Yeah, that's just crazy talk.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe we should start. Start. You think you've already knocked both of those down really well. But I suppose I want to check in a little bit. Are these the two main arguments, these ones that I've kind of pulled up here? I mean, V, have you noticed other valid or semi-valid or anything else that's being put forward to justify the trans service ban that we're dealing with for almost 4 years?
I think the only other thing here is that weird hypersexualization of trans people that is present in a lot of what you hear in terms of the bathroom bills and teaching sex ed in a trans inclusive way is like, oh, there's something way too sexual and like predatory about that. And I think that another component, again, very closely ties to the don't ask, don't tell policies that were implemented to keep gay people out of the military, which was, oh no, we're just so afraid that like trans people will be sexual predators or some kind of weird trumped up charge around that, when in fact the military is pretty bad about maintaining its people in that way already. Like there is a big problem with sexual assault in the military as it stands. So the fact that they're suddenly so concerned about it in this way is so transparent, honestly.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, that it's obviously a fake argument and really just an excuse, but it does raise an interesting question without even getting into the idea of military service and, the military we've already kind of poked fun at and acknowledged is maybe perhaps a little bit overfunded and maybe doesn't always have the right ideals in mind. I mean, just very much tiptoeing on this very obvious iceberg, but I do worry about the notion of a trans woman serving openly in our military just because of the way cis women are treated in the military and the overwhelming incidents of rape and other forms of assault. It makes me a little uncomfortable. And I guess that kind of goes back to that first argument around unit cohesion. But I think that if somebody is willing to put themselves in that situation, which, we're talking about soldiers, folks who are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, if somebody's willing to be in a shitty transphobic unit, which is not anything that anybody should ever have to do, and is not a thing that should even exist. But if they're willing to put themselves in that situation, is there any valid reason to deny them that opportunity?
I don't know if we can say that they are willing to put themselves in this situation, because sometimes you join the army because of very different reasons. My reasons were because I needed to leave home as soon as possible because it was a matter of survival to me. So in that case, I was a transgender in the army, but not necessarily by choice. I mean, the reason why you enlist and then the reason why you decide to go through the process of transition, that's two very different things. So, but the only valid argument, I would say, and I've never heard it, and I don't want to give ammunitions to go against this, but the transition period is very, very stressful. It's very, very hard psychologically, and being in a stressful environment during that time could be dangerous for the person and the people around. So that doesn't mean we should ban people to go in the military. That just means we need to make some adjustments during the transition period. That's all. I don't see any valid reason to prevent people from serving at all. I mean, you have the biggest army on the planet, and what's the percentage of soldiers in that? You also have medical people, you have cooks, you have mechanics, you have pilots, you have plenty of different jobs in the army. So people can be all of these, do all those jobs in the military without having a transition in having an impact on their job. So I don't see any valid reason to prevent trans from joining the army. I really don't.
Yeah, well, not to mention just the logistics of such an idea. I mean, we have already seen that this ban that did exist was tied up in the courts and was basically impossible to do much of anything with, other than to, intimidate and use as a club rhetorically. But nevertheless, you can't create a ban because anybody who enlists could potentially be trans. Yeah, they may or may not know it themselves, especially if you have a 16, 17, 18-year-old person who is, in their ROTC and that gets under contract and that eventually commits. You have no way of knowing what their experience is going to be. So there's basically no way to go about this. So I think we just have to acknowledge it for what it is, which is a form of intimidation and really violence and aggression towards trans folks writ large.
Absolutely. And I also think that it's useful in this conversation of talking about, should the military in the way that it exists even be a thing? Should we be recruiting 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old people into the military? Apart from that conversation, which is valid and should be discussed, being in the military gives groups of people who are able to serve an ability to integrate into society in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Not only socially, not only in the way that other people look at them different as respectable citizens, as veterans, as people who have defended our country, but also in the way of, a lot of people join the army to get free college, to get housing, to get food, to get a career. And this is a unfortunate pipeline for a lot of people who could not afford this otherwise. But to cut an entire demographic out of this, regardless of what you think of the institution as a whole, is very blatantly discriminatory.
Yeah, cutting people out of access to that education, to that social standing. I think that's a really fair point, and one I hadn't really considered. Thank you for bringing that up. I've got a stack of other issues I'd like us to kind of rifle through here, but were there any last thoughts as we're kind of focusing here on the transgender military ban?
No, the only difficulty is, for example, when I started the hormone treatment, I was positioned in a location where homophobia and racism and misogyny were very, very strong. And so, for example, if I had wanted to start grow my hair still as a man, that would have caused some problems, because even though my unit leader was very accepting of it, not everyone else around would have been okay with that. So it's those little details that need really education and understanding and working really.
Absolutely.
Well, if it's all right with y'all, let's see if we can't tackle a few more issues before we jump onto the calls. I'm going to queue up what I feel like is a softball just to get us into rhythm here. Let's talk a little bit about anti-trans bathroom bills. Okay. What is the possible justification here? I mean, if the argument is that we are protecting women from assault, how does that hold up? Are we protecting any women, cis or trans, using this type of approach or applying this sort of philosophy?
I don't know how many people use the excuse to be a transgender to assault a woman in the bathroom. How many times did this happen?
In the research I was able to find in preparing for this episode, maybe 5 in the last 5 years, depending on how you measure, maybe 0. So,
Well, I do know for a fact that people have done the research, and it's less than the number of times that a GOP elected official did such a thing. So, like, if we're worried about statistics here, probably we shouldn't allow GOP officials into bathrooms ever. That's just common sense, you guys.
it seems pretty reasonable, yeah. I should mention that there is a meta-analysis study in the show notes to this episode for anybody who really wants to dive into the numbers and the particulars. I've got as many large general studies as I could find referencing the numbers for any of these things you might be curious about. But yeah, this doesn't seem to be a solution to any particular problem that I can really identify. So how else can we interpret it? How else should we be seeing this idea?
I think it's just fear of being of feeling awkward when you see someone who doesn't fit the idea we have of what's a woman and what's a man. And I think that's just the source of this bill. It's just when you're a woman and you see someone who looks like something between a man and a woman and you feel uncomfortable, I think that's just what this law is about. I don't know,
I
V, what you
agree.
think?
I think that there is a very blatant appeal to discomfort here, but only a certain demographics discomfort, right? If you're forcing a trans man who in all other respects passes into the woman's bathroom, that's going to cause this discomfort for everybody involved, right? Nobody's going to be comfortable in that situation. If you're going to force trans women into men's bathrooms, that's going to put them at risk, right? If we're worried about people being assaulted in bathrooms, probably what that's going to look like is a trans woman forced to use the men's room and then being assaulted there. So we're so concerned about this non-existent percentage-wise demographic of people who are potentially at risk, and in focusing on that are completely erasing the actual risk that an actual statistical majority of people would be facing if we put this legislation into practice.
Yeah, because it also forgets the idea that when you're doing your transition, going to bathrooms and showers and all this is the most stressful part.
Yes.
For you. And if I'm not mistaken, the suicide rate in trans people is 8 times the average, and that's one of the reasons. So if you really want to ensure the safety of people, including transgenders, then you should make this thing not a thing.
Absolutely.
And make non-binary, non-gendered toilets. That's the easiest way to solve this problem.
Yeah, which I agree is a great solution that at least on paper meets everybody's needs and makes, us crazy, gender evangelists very, very happy. And yet we recognize that it's not a acceptable solution for so many people. And it comes back to that discomfort factor that V highlighted. I think that is everything that we are talking about here. It is 100%. I have a conceptualization in my head of what the category of woman is meant to look like. And that conceptualization is very narrow and very, very small. And it cuts off definitely trans women, at least many of them, but a ton of cis women. And that's
exactly
the issue with a gender critical lens.
There's also something I think we should take into consideration. It's that for many women, toilets is the place where they can feel safe, especially when they're in a workplace environment where there are a lot of men. And the toilets are the only place where they know they can be themselves. They can do everything they have to do with their health and all that. So I think it's another aspect to take into consideration, because if we force genderless toilets, then we remove this safe space for women.
Yeah, it's a fair consideration. It feels unfortunate to me that the conceptualization of what a woman is so narrow in the public mind, and that basically forces this this experience. I don't know. I don't know that there is a simple solution to how our bathroom policy should be structured. But I do know that it is absolutely baffling to me that the solution seems to be, well, trans people just don't pee. You know,
Right.
I don't want to conflate two issues or overcomplicate things, but there has been a raging debate in our city, Vi, here in Austin, as we work to figure out how to properly house the homeless population that exists
Yeah.
here. And one short-term solution has been to remove a number of different bans and things that prevent homeless folks from being able to camp out or to create structures. And that has certainly upset a lot of people, because there are folks camping out on the side of the road and things like that. And there comes a lot of like vitriol and anger, and, you know, these people need to leave. So then we find housing for them and we find places for them to go. But then the response comes back, well, not in my neighborhood. You know,
Yeah.
they can't live here. And it's just this lack of concern for where people go. You know, it's just this
Exactly.
idea that they don't need to exist when you break it down. And I hate that it's so common, and that we've honestly spent a full 10 minutes talking about this topic, because it feels like such a no-brainer. But I know from countless conversations with folks that are struggling with their gender identity and coming to a therapist that this is such a prevalent issue, and I just don't get it.
Yeah, and talk about the real world implications of this as well. I know we tend to talk about trans people, especially trans women of color, in these very mortal terms. Like, this is the number who died this year, and that's an important figure to bring up. But let's also talk about the other things that happen. There have been studies done. Trans people, especially trans women, have higher UTI reports. Like they report more UTIs. Why?
Mhm.
Because they cannot use bathrooms when they need them. Like, they're actually harming themselves and giving themselves infections to avoid the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of trauma that happen in these bathrooms when they're being judged or forced out or you know, attacked.
Well, we're getting a little bit ahead.
And again,
Yeah,
that's
please go ahead, Cindy.
purely.
I'd like to give you the last word on this before we jump into the next one.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's just a purely American problem, because I've never heard any such problem in Europe. Never.
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't see why it's even a topic.
Well, and it's frankly just aggravating to me that it is 2021 that we are able to put together a show like this, beaming to you live from a half dozen different houses scattered in all over the globe, honestly. And yet we're somehow unable to look across the pond and be like, oh, this is like Europe people aren't having a problem with this. You know, anyway, we've got a stack of these topics that I really wanted to go through, so I'll try to pick up the pace and let us rifle through them. Here's something with, I suppose, a little more nuance. Explain to me why we are protecting women, or how we're protecting women and fair competition by preventing trans women from competing in athletics. How does that argument play out, or how does this work?
So this one is much more complicated, because it depends on the sport, and depends on several factors, because the impact of a transition on someone who plays soccer is different from someone who plays who's a runner, because depending on the sport, the characteristics that are used are different, and the impact of HRT on those characteristics is different. So if you want to know what's the impact of being trans in a specific sport, you have to study this specific sport and not take global figures. So to answer your question, I think it's hard to say we're protecting women, because what we're protecting really it's our vision of sports, where we have sports for women and we have sports for men, categories for men, categories for women, when in fact maybe we should have categories depending on the array of characteristics required in that specific sport. That would make more sense than just men and women, because you have women taller than some men. You have the opposite. You have men and women stronger than some men, and I think the discussion we need to have is how we think about equity in sport, and I think that's a discussion we need to have. And to me, the only way to solve this problem is to say, okay, like in martial arts sports, we have categories depending on weight. We could do that in other sports, but not just weight, but maybe we could measure the muscle rate. We could measure. I don't know. I think it has to be studied sport by sport, because, like I said, each sport has its own set of characteristics that are in charge, and we can draw a definitive conclusion to all sports, in my opinion.
I think that's fair to say, and there's definitely a lot of nuance here, and that's perhaps the most important takeaway is that, you know, whether we're looking at the guidelines published by the International Olympic Committee or any of a number of organizations, those guidelines are usually fairly complex, certainly more so than the local middle school that, you know, has just decided to throw somebody out callously and carelessly. But I guess my real wondering is if this is a question of like where to draw the line or how to draw your boxes and what your categories should look like, what's the organizing principle? You know, without getting too deep into the hormone levels or the body mass percentages or height or weight or, you know, the specifics of an individual sport, do you have a through line for us on what that organizing idea should maybe look like in dividing up competition? Or is that too philosophical for one person to even wrap their head around?
No, I think it has to be purely mechanical, in my opinion. We take one sport, we measure what characteristics are in play for that sport, and then we define categories on the array of these characteristics. I think it shouldn't be that complicated, to be honest.
Also, we have to keep in mind that the way that things are divvied up now impact cis women too. Like that's part of this larger conversation. I know anybody who cares about this topic has been following the Castor-Semenya decision, right? Of, I believe it was last year or the year before, where a woman, like a cis woman, was kicked out of her sport because she didn't meet certain requirements in terms of hormone levels and so forth. So the fact that we are saying, oh, we need to protect the cis women, you know, in these sports, and then in an effort to discriminate against trans people, actually end up doubling back and also cutting cis women out of things, it just reveals how messy this whole thing is and how the goal of protecting the cisses is not the goal at all. It's discrimination against people who don't fit your criteria.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and you can see it when you look at some specific sportsmen who have a natural advantage, like Michael Phelps. He doesn't create as much as I don't remember the hormone that's, when you exercise, your muscles produce something that makes them get tired very quickly, and I don't remember the name. I had it a few minutes ago, but he doesn't produce this as much as anyone else. And when people discovered this, they were just stunned. Oh wow, he's got he's blessed. He's got this big advantage. But then when you took the example of Castemania, when she has a natural advantage, but because she's, I think she's got XXY chromosome, and that makes her somehow a freak compared to him. That's just there's no reason to make the difference.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, if y'all are ready, let's keep going with these. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about affirmation and gender care for trans adolescents. I get that this is a little bit of a question of like, where do you draw the line? But as John Oliver says, when the question is, where do you draw the line? The answer is always fucking somewhere. You don't just say that trans kids need to wait until 18 to do anything to affirm their gender. It's more a question of what is appropriate. And I guess I'm curious how we should organize this as well. What our criteria for drawing that line should look like, and whether or not it's appropriate for us to, have legislation and like these large lines that are drawn culturally, or if that is a purely family or personal and individual line to draw. These are big questions. I know we're kind of racing through them, but I'd love to just hear y'all's thoughts about how we should be considering these arguments.
So I'm going against the policy of many trans associations here, because I think starting the process with a trained psychiatrist is, in my opinion, very important, because there are some people who are not exactly aware of all the differences between sexual orientation, sexual gender expression, and all these things, and they can be mistaken. And it's even more important when we start before the teenage years. So I'm totally in favor of imposing even one. In France, it's you have to have one appointment with a psychiatrist. He just asks you questions and then gives you a paper saying, yes, you're transgender. And that's what happened with me. Not right away, because the first one I saw just thought I was sick, and she had to try to cure me before allowing me to go through the transition. But the second one I saw just went through after the first appointment. And we need to create more big structures. Here in Belgium, we have there's the best team in Europe, and it's a pluridisciplinary team. You have endocrinologists, you have psychiatrists, you have surgeons, you have everything that deals with transgender almost in the same building. And all those people talk to each other and work with each other. And so if we want to offer children the best environment possible, we need to offer them this kind of environment. See a psychiatrist with the parents in the first place. And then if we see that the child is indeed transgender, then allow them to go through the HRT as soon as possible, because again, that has an impact, including on sports, because if you start the hormone treatment before puberty, then there's literally no difference between an adult woman and an adult trans woman.
When
Yeah,
I know, please go ahead, V.
My thinking here is pretty straightforward, and I love that Cindy is driving home the nuance here. For me, I'm gonna go back out and kind of pull back and say, you know what? The same reasoning that applies to Roe v. Wade applies here. This is a medical decision made by individuals with their doctor, and the government has no part in that conversation. Right now in the UK, they just passed a law that if you want any kind of trans-affirming care before the age of, I believe, 16, you have to go in front of a court judge to be allowed to do it. It is no longer a question of just having a doctor weigh in. It now has become actually a legal and a government regulated practice. So for me, I'm happy to debate all day where that line is, Christy, but ultimately it is going to come down to, is this a conversation between a person and their doctor versus is this a conversation that the state needs to be involved in somehow?
Yeah, well, I think an important piece of this here is recognizing, of course, that we are talking about minors. And so their parental involvement and parental consent is definitely a sticky wicket. You know, just because you are a parent doesn't necessarily mean that you have the child's best interest in mind. But I also don't know who else we trust with that responsibility, whether it is just the doctor and the patient. And if there's a difference between whether or not that patient is 4 versus 14 versus 17, I don't know if that is a meaningful distinction. But another piece of this I want to make sure that we bring up is that so far we've been having a conversation pretty much just about HRT, about hormone blockers and these other hormone therapies. Does the conversation change if we start talking about surgical options and if we start talking about more permanent fixes? Does that, in your mind, impact where we draw that line? I'm getting head shakes from both of y'all, but for the podcast audience, walk me through your rationale a little bit.
No, I think the question is, are you a trans person or not? And that's the only answer we need to get. And depending on the answer we get, then you can have HRT and surgery, or just HRT or just surgery, or that's up to you and your doctor.
Yeah, and I think there's a misconstruing in a lot of cases, especially gender critical people, especially people who are against, any kind of trans affirming care, where they assume that when you talk about trans affirming care for a 4-year-old, that's going to mean HRT and surgery, right? It's not going to incorporate that. It's going to be probably some counseling, probably some ability for that kid to choose, how they dress, how they wear their hair, all of this. But until they get to an age of puberty, they're not going to have usually any hormone treatments at all. And then they're just going to be going on hormone blockers, which can be reversed the minute you come off of it. It has no long-term effect except to postpone the puberty. And then only after that, usually, would there even be any talk about surgery at all. So the idea that all of this is kind of compacted into one big scary procedure that you then lay at the feet of 5 and 6-year-olds, of course, there are going to be people who are like, how dare you? But it's just misinformation and it's misdirection, because the actual conversation, again, is that much more complicated.
Yeah, I really appreciate you drawing out the nuance in all of that and acknowledging that this is a very complex thing, but it's a complex thing that is full of misinformation. And I think that when we get a lot of, Facebook Karen hot takes, there's a lack of that information and a lack of understanding about exactly how this process actually looks. So I know we are already almost halfway through the show here, and so I want to give Vi a chance to jump onto the phones. While V's getting that pulled up, do either of y'all have any kind of last thoughts about the importance of how this line is drawn, or how we have these conversations, specifically around trans adolescents?
No, just the fundamentals. We need to educate people. If parents have some preconceptions about what transgenders are, they will take bad decisions for their kids. So they need to be educated. That's the only thing we need to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. We need to educate the parents as well, especially if they're the ones who are going to be making these decisions for their kids.